A millionaire believed he had seen it all: riches, travels, and conquests that placed him among the most powerful. But nothing prepared him to raise his disabled son alone, in a silent mansion filled with absences, until the cook's son entered their lives. And a simple gesture transformed pain into hope, loneliness into friendship, and silence into laughter. Prepare yourself, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes, the most valuable lessons come through hands we never imagined. In the Thompson mansion, silence had physical presence. It hovered through the corridors like an unwelcome guest, glided along marble walls, infiltrated empty rooms. It was a different silence from the kind that precedes storms. It was the silence that remains after they pass and devastate everything. Richard Thompson knew well every note of that silence. He had learned to live with it since Laura departed, taking with her the laughter that once echoed through those rooms. What remained behind was only the echo, his and that of Philip, his 9-year-old son, trapped in a wheelchair, and a body that stubbornly refused to obey the commands of the brilliant mind he possessed. That autumn morning, while watching his son sleep, Richard felt the familiar weight settling in his chest. A man accustomed to solving problems with the force of money and influence now found himself before the only equation for which he could find no solution. As a father, he had failed. As a man, he felt incomplete. As a businessman, he found himself divided between the empire he had built and the son he barely knew. The bedroom door creaked softly. It was Martha, the housekeeper, with the breakfast tray. "You slept here again, sir," she commented, without surprise in her voice. Richard ran his hand over his face, feeling his unshaven beard. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on Philip, whose fingers moved slightly over the white sheet, as if playing an invisible piano in his dreams. The Thompson empire could wait. The contracts, meetings, millions, all of that was just a shadow before the true challenge life had imposed on him. Learning to be father to a boy the world insisted on defining only by his limitations, ignoring the light that Richard, in his loneliest moments, could see in his son's eyes. Downstairs, Emily arrived for her first day of work. At 42, she carried in her calloused hands the experience of someone who had always cooked to survive. Her clean, pressed apron was her armor against a world that had never been kind to women like her. Widows, poor, single mothers. Be discreet, efficient, and above all, professional. She repeated in thought the words from the employment agency. Mr. Thompson doesn't like noise or intimacies. What no one had warned her, however, was that on that day her son, Peter, 16 years old, would have to accompany her. The school was under renovation, and leaving him alone in the small apartment where they lived was not an option. "Mom, I can stay in the kitchen. No one will even notice I'm there," promised the boy, as they walked through the impeccable garden surrounding the mansion. "I'll bring my books. Stay quiet." Emily held her son's hand tightly. Peter was her joy, her pride, her strength, a boy with an easy smile and generous heart, even growing up in a neighborhood where violence and lack of opportunities daily cut down dreams. Raising him alone had never been easy, but Peter compensated every sacrifice with his kindness and determination. "It's not that simple, son," she replied, looking at the imposing construction ahead. "This house has rules, and I really need this job." What both didn't know was that, by crossing that door, it wouldn't be only their lives that would change forever. Philip woke with warm sun on his face. Birds sang in the garden, but he barely paid attention. He was used to waking alone, though he knew his father had probably spent the night in the armchair beside his bed, leaving only when day broke, carrying on his back the weight of a responsibility he had never desired. With effort, the boy moved his body in the special bed that occupied almost all the room's space. His eyes rested on the photo frame on the bedside table. His mother, Laura, with the smile that Philip treasured as a memory. He was only 5 when she departed, taken by fulminant cancer that gave no time for proper goodbyes. The sound of steps in the corridor alerted him to the arrival of Antonia, the morning nurse. Philip closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. He wasn't in the mood for the morning ritual of medications, bath, and exercises that always left him exhausted before the day even began. "Good morning, sunshine." Antonia's artificially animated voice invaded the room along with the smell of disinfectant and cheap perfume. "Time to wake up and face the day." Philip kept his eyes closed. He hated that condescending tone, as if he were a small child or incapable of understanding the world around him. In truth, he understood too much. He understood the pitying looks, conversations interrupted when he entered an environment, forced smiles. He understood that his body was a prison and that people saw only the wheelchair, not the boy inside it. Come on, Philip. Today will be a special day, continued Antonia, while opening the curtains completely, flooding the room with morning brightness. Your father left a message saying he'll return earlier from work. Maybe you two can do something together. The boy finally opened his eyes, without hope. How many times had he heard that promise? Richard Thompson always had good intentions, but the empire he had built demanded his constant presence. And deep down, Philip suspected his father felt more comfortable among contracts and negotiations than facing the reality of a son who would never correspond to the expectations of such a powerful man. The routine began as always: medications, frustrated attempts to swallow breakfast, the painful bath where each movement was a struggle. When Antonia finally placed him in the wheelchair, Philip felt the exhaustion he knew so well. "Shall we take a walk in the garden before classes?" suggested the nurse, pushing the chair toward the door. Philip didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the window, where a small sparrow had perched on the sill. What would it feel like to be free like that? To fly when he wanted, go where he wished without depending on anyone? A solitary tear rolled down his face, but Antonia was too busy arranging pillows to notice. In the kitchen, Emily tried to familiarize herself with sophisticated equipment she had never seen before. Imported pans, utensils whose names she didn't know, appliances that seemed from a futuristic movie. Martha, the stern-looking housekeeper, had given her basic instructions. Breakfast at 7 a.m. for the staff, lunch at noon, varied snacks for young Philip following a strict diet, and dinner at 8 p.m. if Mr. Thompson was home. "The boy has special needs," Martha explained, handing her a folder with menus approved by the nutritionist. "No refined sugar, gluten, or dairy, and everything must be prepared in the appropriate consistency to facilitate swallowing." Peter observed everything from a corner of the kitchen, leafing through a biology book without really paying attention. His curious eyes captured every detail of that environment that seemed from another planet, compared to their apartment's cramped kitchen. "Can I help with something?" he asked when Martha finally left. Emily smiled, grateful for her son's company. "You can wash these fruits for the breakfast juice. And remember, speak softly and don't leave the kitchen, please." The boy nodded, heading to the sink. Through the window, he spotted the impeccable garden, with sculptures, fountains, and geometric flower beds. It seemed more like an open-air museum than a place to live. That's when he noticed in the distance a nurse pushing a wheelchair where a thin boy looked at the horizon, oblivious to everything. "Mom," he called softly. "Is that the house owner's son?" Emily followed her son's gaze and nodded. "Yes, Philip. He has cerebral palsy from what Martha told me. Don't talk about it. It's not our business." But Peter continued watching. There was something about that boy in the way his eyes seemed distant yet intensely present that awakened his curiosity. He knew that look. It was the same he saw in school classmates when they felt invisible, inadequate, excluded. And Peter, with his open heart, had never been able to ignore others' pain. The encounter happened that same afternoon as naturally as it was unpredictable. Peter was helping his mother store groceries that had arrived when he heard something falling in the corridor leading to the kitchen. Going out to check, he found Philip, alone in his chair, trying to reach a book that had fallen on the floor. The nurse was nowhere to be seen. The boy struggled to lean forward, but his body wouldn't obey, and frustration was visible on his face. Peter hesitated only for a second. He approached with light steps, without hurry. He didn't want to frighten the boy or make him feel exposed in his difficulty. "Hi," he said simply, stopping at a respectful distance. "Can I help?" Philip raised his eyes, surprised not to hear the condescending tone he was used to receiving. He analyzed the young man before him. Faded jeans, simple t-shirt, worn sneakers, clearly not another specialist hired by his father. "Who are you?" he asked with difficulty, words coming out dragged, fighting against the body that insisted on betraying him. "Peter. My mom is the new cook," the young man replied, without looking away or showing discomfort with the boy's truncated speech. "I'm only here today because my school is under renovation." Without waiting for permission, Peter crouched and picked up the book from the floor. Instead of simply handing it over, he examined the cover with genuine interest. Astronomy for young explorers, he read aloud. Do you like stars? Philip's face lit up with an intensity he rarely showed. He nodded vigorously, and his fingers moved toward the book. They're incredible, he managed to say with visible effort, but without that diminishing the brightness in his eyes. Peter smiled, sitting on the floor, right there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He opened the book on his lap. My favorite subject at school is science, he commented, leafing through the colorful pages. But I never studied much about astronomy. What's your favorite constellation? Philip blinked, confused. He wasn't used to being treated as someone with valid opinions, with preferences that mattered. People usually talked about him, not with him. And here was this stranger, sitting on his father's mansion floor, asking about his favorite constellations, as if talking to any other boy. With difficult movements, Philip managed to point to an image in the book. Orion. Good choice, Peter approved. The Hunter. It has the brightest stars, doesn't it? You can see it even from the city. That's when it happened. A hoarse, hesitant but unmistakable sound. Philip was laughing. A short, almost shy laugh, as if he had unlearned how to express joy. Peter didn't make a big deal of it, didn't react as if witnessing a miracle. He just continued the conversation, showing the book's figures, commenting on each one, telling a silly joke about a distracted astronaut his science teacher had told him once. When Antonia returned, 15 minutes later, she found the two absorbed in a conversation about black holes. Peter speaking animatedly and Philip responding with gestures, expressions, and occasionally short words that the young man seemed to have no difficulty understanding. What's happening here? The nurse asked, alarmed. Who are you? How did you get in? Peter stood up calmly. Sorry, I'm the new cook's son. The book fell and we were talking about astronomy. Antonia cast a suspicious look, clearly disapproving of the proximity. Philip needs to rest before his therapies, and you shouldn't be here. Philip's smile disappeared instantly, replaced by his usual closed expression. Peter noticed the change and felt a pang in his chest. He handed the book to the boy carefully. It was a pleasure meeting you, Philip. Maybe we can continue our conversation another day, he said, as if it were a promise. Before turning to leave, he saw the boy's eyes brighten again, in a silent gratitude that said more than any word. Richard Thompson crossed the mansion gates. Earlier than usual, the meeting with foreign investors had been cancelled at the last hour, opening a rare gap in his schedule. In other circumstances, he would have filled the time with more work, but something impelled him to return home. Perhaps the persistent guilt for all broken promises, perhaps the faint hope that this time he could really connect with his son. The familiar silence greeted him, but there was something different in the air. An inviting aroma came from the kitchen, fresh spices, baking bread, life. Not the aseptic, personalityless smell of recent years when meals were merely nutritional obligations. Following the aroma, Richard found an unusual scene. A woman he presumed to be the new cook hummed softly while cutting vegetables. Beside her, a teenager separated herbs, laughing at something she had said. The naturalness of the scene, the simple intimacy between mother and son, hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. How many times had Laura and he dreamed of moments like this? How many times had he imagined Philip growing up in an environment full of laughter and trivial conversations? The woman noticed his presence and immediately straightened her posture. The young man also noticed, stopping mid-gesture. Mr. Thompson, we weren't expecting you so early, she said, visibly nervous. I'm Emily, the new cook, and this is my son, Peter. I apologize for bringing him today, but I had nowhere to leave him, and Richard raised his hand in a gesture that interrupted the hurried explanation. His eyes studied the teenager, 16 years old perhaps, medium height, direct gaze, without the intimidated subservience he was used to seeing in employees. There's no problem, he replied, surprising himself with the ease of the concession. Just don't interfere with your mother's work. Peter nodded, without looking away. I won't interfere, sir. Actually, I'm helping. There was a natural dignity in the boy that Richard couldn't help but notice. A quiet confidence that wasn't arrogance, just the security of someone who knows their place in the world, however simple it may be. Do you study? He asked, moved by uncommon curiosity. Yes, sir. I'm in my junior year of high school. The school is under renovation this week. Emily seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown with that unexpected conversation, but Richard had already lost interest. His mind had returned to Philip, to the promise he had made to spend time with him. Where is my son? He asked the housekeeper, who had just entered the kitchen. "In his room, sir. Antonia is helping him with breathing exercises before the 4 o'clock physical therapy." Richard nodded and turned to leave, but not without first noticing a curious gleam in the teenager's eyes when Philip was mentioned. A spark of, could it be interest? The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to the Thompson mansion. Emily established herself in the kitchen, bringing colors and flavors that had long been absent. Richard noticed the difference, not just in the food, but in the atmosphere. Philip's meals, always a challenge, seemed less problematic. The boy even occasionally asked for seconds, something that never happened before. Peter continued appearing after school, helping his mother with small tasks. Richard didn't object. There was something comforting about hearing another young voice in the house, even if just in passing, when walking by the kitchen. What Richard didn't know was that, in moments when Antonia was distracted or during shift, changes between caregivers, Peter and Philip had established a secret ritual. They met in the garden, in the library, sometimes just for a few minutes. The teenager brought adapted games he invented, interesting books, or simply stories from the outside world that Philip absorbed eagerly. For the boy in the wheelchair, those moments were windows to a life he had never experienced. Peter didn't treat him as an obligation, a case of pity, or a project. He treated him as he would treat any friend, with honesty, humor, and the occasional impatience that makes human relationships authentic. "Have you ever watched Star Trek?" Peter asked one afternoon, while pushing Philip's chair through the garden, taking advantage of Antonia having gone to fetch a sweater for the boy. Philip shook his head negatively. "Seriously? It's incredible. It's about people exploring space, meeting other civilizations. It has science, adventure, everything you like." Philip's eyes sparkled with curiosity. He made a gesture that Peter had learned to recognize. He wanted to know more. "I'll bring a book about the series tomorrow," promised the teenager. "And who knows, maybe one day we can watch together. I have all episodes saved on my old tablet." Philip smiled, a smile that was becoming increasingly frequent and natural. His hands moved in a gesture Peter now understood perfectly. "I would like that." It was at that moment that Richard appeared around the garden curve. He was returning from a solitary walk through the mansion grounds, something he did when he needed to think. The sight of his son being pushed by the teenager caught him off guard. Even more surprising was Philip's expression, relaxed, happy, alive. Peter stopped immediately upon seeing the house owner. "Mr. Thompson, we were just—" "Where is Antonia?" asked Richard, his voice more curious than accusatory. "She went to get a sweater for Philip. It's getting cold. I offered to continue the walk so he wouldn't have to go back yet." Richard studied the young man, then looked at his son, whose face had assumed its usual closed expression in his father's presence. The difference was so glaring it hurt. "Does Philip enjoy your company?" he asked directly. The boy in the chair nodded vigorously before Peter could answer. His hands moved in gestures the father didn't understand, but that clearly communicated something to the teenager. "He's saying we're talking about astronomy and science fiction series," Peter translated. "Naturally. I promised to bring a book about Star Trek tomorrow." Richard blinked, surprised. "You understand his gestures?" Peter shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We've been getting to know each other for a few weeks. It's not that hard when you pay attention." The simplicity of the answer hit Richard like a silent accusation. How many times had he truly tried to understand his own son's gestures? How many times had he simply nodded, pretending to understand, to avoid embarrassment for both? "You've become friends," he stated, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own son's life. Philip made another gesture, and this time it was Peter's face that lit up with a smile. "What did he say?" asked Richard, unable to contain his curiosity. "He said I'm his first friend," Peter replied, with a mixture of pride and sadness in his voice. "But I'm sure that's not true. He must have had other friends before." The silence that followed confirmed the contrary. Richard felt the weight of that revelation. His son, 9 years old, had never had a friend until the cook's son arrived. "Why you?" The question escaped before he could contain it. It wasn't an accusation, but a genuine doubt, almost a plea for help. Peter looked at Philip, then at Richard. "Maybe because I'm not afraid of not knowing what to do," he replied honestly. "I just ask him what he wants, and we try to figure out together how to make it happen." The profound simplicity of that answer left Richard speechless. Before he could elaborate, Antonia appeared running, distressed to see Philip out of her reach. "Mr. Thompson, I just went to get a jacket and—" "Everything is fine, Antonia," interrupted Richard, with a calm that surprised everyone, including himself. Peter was taking good care of Philip. It seems they have a lot in common. The surprised look his son gave him was like a small ray of light amid the darkness that had separated them for so long. Peter's presence became increasingly constant in the mansion. Richard, contrary to all expectations, not only allowed but began to discreetly encourage the meetings between the boys. He noticed the changes in Philip, more communicative, more willing to participate in therapies, sleeping better, eating better. The teenager had a natural gift for including the boy in activities that professional caregivers would never consider possible. One day, Richard came home and found the two in the garden, Peter sitting on the ground beside Philip's chair, both with hands dirty from soil. "What are you doing?" he asked, approaching with curiosity. "Planting sunflower seeds," Peter replied, without interrupting what he was doing. Philip had never planted anything before. "I thought it would be cool." Philip raised his dirty hands, showing them to his father with a proud smile. There was a liveliness in his eyes that Richard rarely saw. "Who had the idea?" asked Richard, addressing his son directly, something he realized he did less frequently than he should. Philip pointed to his own chest with determination. He chose. "Sunflowers after we read about how they always turn toward the sun," Peter explained. "I found it symbolic." Richard felt a knot in his throat. He crouched down, observing the small flower bed the boys had prepared. "Can I help?" The astonishment on Philip's face was almost painful to witness. His father, the powerful Richard Thompson, in his suit and Italian shoes, offering to dirty his hands with soil. "Of course," Peter replied naturally, handing him some seeds. "Philip will show you how to do it." And so, in a corner of the mansion's immense garden, something happened that Richard had never imagined. He followed his son's instructions, learning from him, connecting through an act as simple as planting a seed. Not everything was roses, however. The growing closeness between Peter and Philip began to awaken diverse reactions among the house staff and, eventually, among Richard's relatives. Martha, the housekeeper, was the first to express reservations. "Sir, I don't think it's appropriate for the cook's son to have so much freedom with Philip," she commented one night, while Richard worked in his office. "People have defined places, and confusing that can create problematic expectations." Richard raised his eyes from the documents he was analyzing. "What kind of expectations, Martha?" The woman hesitated, choosing her words. "The young man is from another world, sir, another social class, and with all respect, Philip is impressionable. He's becoming too attached." "My son never had a friend before," Richard replied, with a coldness he didn't really feel. "Peter has been good for him. The therapists have noticed significant progress." "I understand, sir, but perhaps it would be better to find more suitable friends. Children of your business partners, perhaps. Kids who share the same background." Richard closed the folder he was examining with an abrupt movement. "And where were these suitable children for the past 9 years, Martha? I didn't see any of them offering to be my son's friend." The housekeeper retreated, surprised by the reaction. "I apologize, sir. I just thought that." "I appreciate your concern," interrupted Richard, regaining control. "But, for now, things will continue as they are." The criticism didn't stop there. Antonia, the nurse, began reporting concerns about Peter's influence. She questioned whether the teenager had adequate training to deal with someone with Philip's conditions, if he understood the risks, if he wasn't encouraging dangerous activities. Richard listened to everything with decreasing patience. What none of them seemed to understand was that, for the first time in years, his son was living, not just existing. The last straw came in the form of Helena, Laura's older sister, and Philip's aunt. During a weekend visit, she witnessed Peter helping Philip play video games with adapted controls the teenager himself had improvised. "Richard, we need to talk," she announced later, with the authority of someone who believed they knew her nephew's best interest better. "This arrangement is completely inappropriate." "What arrangement, Helena?" he asked, already anticipating the conversation's direction. "That young man, the maid's son, having unrestricted access to Philip. It's imprudent and, frankly, irresponsible on your part." Richard breathed deeply, containing growing irritation. "Peter has been good for Philip. The doctors have noticed significant improvements in his development since they became friends." Helena shook her head, incredulous. "Friends? Richard, don't you see what's happening? That boy and his mother obviously have ulterior motives. You're a rich man, alone, vulnerable. Stop." Richard's voice came out louder than he intended. Peter has shown no interest in anything other than friendship with my son. And if you knew Philip minimally, you'd know he would never respond like this to someone who wasn't genuine. You're blind, Richard. You always were when it came to character judgment. Laura always said, "Don't use Laura to validate your prejudices." He cut her off, feeling anger boiling under his skin. My wife valued people for who they were, not for their bank account or social position. And if she were here, she'd be happy to see Philip smiling again. Helena retreated, but didn't surrender. It's not prejudice, Richard. It's caution. Do you have any idea what people are saying? That you let some random teenager take care of your son while you sink into work to avoid facing your responsibilities. The words hit Richard like a physical blow, because, in part, they were true. How many times had he used work as refuge? How many times had he delegated Philip's care to paid strangers to be there? Maybe we all need to learn something from this. Random teenager, he finally replied, more to himself than to his sister-in-law. He sees Philip as none of us managed to see, as a complete person, not as a problem to be managed. Helena shook her head, defeated. You'll regret this, Richard. People like that always want something. Always. When she left that night, she left behind a seed of doubt that, no matter how hard he tried, Richard couldn't completely ignore. Peter felt the looks, the whispers, the growing distrust. He wasn't naive. He knew how the world worked, how people like him were seen in places like that. But for Philip, he would endure everything. "Mom, is something wrong?" he asked one night, while helping Emily clean the kitchen after dinner. "You're quiet." The woman hesitated, drying her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Helena talked to me today." Peter's heart accelerated. "About what?" "About you and young Philip." Emily sat at the table, suddenly looking exhausted. "She thinks we're taking advantage of the situation, that you're getting too close to the boss's son, and that this could create problems." Peter felt his face burn. "That's ridiculous. Philip is my friend. He needs a friend, Mom." "I know, son." Emily held the young man's hands between hers. "I believe in you, but people like us, we live in a different world from theirs, and they'll always think we want something beyond what we say we want." "What did she suggest?" asked Peter, fearing the answer. "That I ask you not to come to the mansion anymore, that you come pick me up at the entrance, only." The teenager felt as if something cold slid into his stomach. "And Philip? He'll think I abandoned him like everyone else." Emily lowered her eyes. "I know, son, and it breaks my heart, but I need this job, and you know that." Peter remained silent, fighting against the injustice of the situation. Finally, he stood up with determination. "I need to talk to Mr. Thompson. Explain. He'll understand." "Peter, no." Emily grabbed her son's arm. "You can't just approach the boss. There are protocols, hierarchies, and there's the truth," replied the boy, with a firmness that surprised his mother. "Philip trusts me. I won't betray that trust without at least fighting." The meeting between Peter and Richard happened in the mansion's library on a late afternoon. Peter had formally requested, through Martha, a few minutes of the businessman's time. The unusual request sparked Richard's curiosity, who agreed. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for receiving me," Peter began, standing formally before the imposing dark wood desk. Richard observed the teenager, noticing the tense posture, so different from the naturalness with which he normally behaved. "Sit down, Peter. What can I do for you?" The young man breathed deeply before speaking. "It's about Philip, sir. Your sister-in-law talked to my mother. She wants me to stop coming to the mansion, to not see your son anymore." Richard leaned his elbows on the desk, studying the boy's face. There was genuine anguish there, which no teenager could fake with such conviction. "And what do you think about that?" he asked, testing. "I think it would be cruel to Philip, sir," Peter replied without hesitation. "He's making progress. He's happier, more confident. Abandoning him now would be like confirming what he always feared, that people are only with him out of obligation or pity." The honesty hurt Richard, because it was exactly what he himself had done for years, being with his son out of obligation, not connection. "My sister-in-law thinks you and your mother have ulterior motives," he said directly, watching the boy's reaction. Peter blushed, but maintained firm eye contact. "Sir, with all respect, if we wanted something from you, we would have asked. My mother works hard to support us. And as for me," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "I like Philip, not the millionaire's son, but Philip, the boy who knows more about stars than anyone I know, who has the best sense of humor even when words don't come out as he wants, who never gives up even when it would be easier to give up." Richard felt something warm and uncomfortable rising from his chest to his throat. It was shame. Shame because this teenager knew his son better than he himself did. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Peter looked at his own hands for a moment. "When I was 7, I broke my leg. I was in a cast for 2 months, unable to run or play like other children. It was horrible. I felt alone, invisible, as if the world went on without me, and it was only for 2 months. He raised his eyes, now bright with contained emotion. "Philip feels that every day, but he's not invisible, sir. He's extraordinary, and he deserves to be seen." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Richard stared at the teenager, seeing in him a moral strength that many adults didn't possess. "You can continue coming," he said finally, "and you can continue being my son's friend. As for my sister-in-law, and anyone else who has objections, let me deal with them." The relief on Peter's face was immediate and genuine. "Thank you, sir. I promise you won't regret it." When the young man stood to leave, Richard stopped him with a question. "Peter, what do you want to be when you grow up?" The teenager smiled, a simple and true smile. "A scientist, sir. I want to study the stars." Richard nodded, feeling a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. "I'm sure you'll succeed." The following months brought gradual transformation, not just in Philip, but in the entire mansion's dynamics. The friendship between the boys flourished, now free from the shadows of distrust. Peter came almost daily after school, always bringing something new to share with Philip. A book, a game, a story. The most surprising thing, however, was the change in Richard. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to get more involved in his son's life. Initially, they were just casual questions about what the boys had done that day. Then, it became constant presence at dinners, abandoning the habit of eating alone in the office. One Sunday afternoon, Philip had a crisis. These were bad days that happened occasionally. Painful muscle spasms, accumulated frustration, the body betraying more than usual. Antonia called Richard, who ran to his son's room, finding him in tears, his body rigid with pain. "I already gave him the muscle relaxant," the nurse informed, "but he's very agitated." Richard sat beside the bed, feeling powerless as always in these moments. He tried to hold his son's hand, but Philip withdrew it, turning his face to the wall. "He wants Peter," Antonia said quietly. "He asked for him 3 times. The revelation hit Richard like a blow. His son, in his moment of greatest vulnerability, didn't want his father, but his friend. "Call him," he ordered, surprising the nurse. "Tell him it's urgent." Peter arrived 20 minutes later, breathless from running. He entered the room without hesitation, going directly to the bed where Philip still cried silently. "Hey, astronaut," he said softly, using the nickname he'd given his friend. "Rough day among the stars, huh?" Philip opened his eyes, his face softening upon seeing his friend. He tried to speak, but the pain was too much. "You don't need to say anything," Peter continued, sitting on the bed's edge. "Remember that story about the astronaut lost on Mars? The one we were reading?" Philip nodded slightly. "Well, I found out the ending. Want to hear?" Another nod. Peter began to narrate, improvising on the spot a continuation to the story they had left half finished. A story about survival, hope, and the beauty of the universe even in the loneliest moments. His voice was calm, hypnotic, and Richard watched, amazed, as his son's body gradually relaxed, as his breathing calmed, as his eyes closed no longer in pain, but in comfort. When Philip finally fell asleep, Peter stood up silently. Only then did he notice Richard standing at the door watching the scene. "He's better now," the teenager whispered. Richard nodded, unable to find words to express what he felt. Gratitude, admiration, shame for his own inadequacy as a father, all of it mixed in a tight knot in his throat. "How did you know what to do?" he finally managed to ask as they walked down the corridor, leaving Philip to rest. Peter shrugged. "I didn't know. I just thought about what would make me feel better if I were suffering. Sometimes we just need someone who's really present, you know. Not trying to fix, not despairing, just there." The simplicity of the answer hit Richard with the force of a revelation. It was exactly what he had never managed to do for his son. Be simply present, without trying to resolve, compensate, or flee. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time he didn't feel diminished by thanking this teenager who, in so many ways, was teaching him how to be a father. Philip's 10th birthday was approaching. Richard wanted it to be special, different from the formal and soulless celebrations of previous years. Parties organized by event planners, full of adults and practically no children, where Philip remained isolated in his chair, just watching. "Peter, I need your help," Richard said one afternoon, inviting the teenager to his office. "I want to do something different for Philip's birthday this year, something he would really like." Peter's face lit up. "Can I ask what he would like?" Richard shook his head. "I want it to be a surprise, but you know him better than anyone. What do you think would make him happy?" The teenager thought for a moment. "Philip always talks about the stars, about how he'd like to see them for real, not just in books, and there's a planetarium in the city." "Perfect," exclaimed Richard. "We can reserve the entire planetarium for a private session. Invite specialists. Make a personalized presentation." "Actually," Peter interrupted gently, "I think Philip would prefer something simpler. There's a hill near my house where you can see the sky perfectly on clear nights. We could have a nighttime picnic, bring telescopes. He always says he wants to feel the air, hear the sounds of night, not just see projected images." Richard hesitated. A picnic? On the hill near Peter's house? It was so simple, so different from the extravagances he was used to providing. Wouldn't it be more comfortable for him at the planetarium? The wheelchair, the special needs? Peter smiled. "Philip wants to experience the real world, sir. He spends too much time protected within walls. And we can adapt everything to be comfortable, but authentic." Richard studied the young man before him, realizing once again how Peter saw his son in a way he himself had never managed. Not as a patient, not as a responsibility, but as a boy who desired to live. "All right," he agreed finally. "A picnic under the stars. Let's plan this together." The birthday night arrived with a perfectly clear sky, as if the very stars had conspired to make the moment special. Richard had hired a team to prepare the hill, but strictly following Peter's guidelines. Nothing unnecessary luxurious, nothing ostentatious. There were blankets spread on the ground, pillows for greater comfort, discreet lanterns to light the path. A small silent generator provided power for essential equipment. An amateur astronomer, a science teacher from Peter's school, had brought 2 powerful telescopes. Emily had prepared a basket with Philip's favorite foods, all suitable for his needs. When Richard arrived with his son, Philip's expression upon seeing the scenery was of pure incredulity. His eyes widened, scanning every detail of the simple but perfect preparation. "What do you think?" asked Richard, suddenly nervous, fearing he had erred again. Philip stretched his arm, squeezing his father's hand with surprising strength. In his eyes shone tears, but they were of happiness. Peter appeared then, carrying a package wrapped clumsily. "Happy birthday, astronaut," he exclaimed, handing the present to Philip. "This is from me and my mom." With slow but determined movements, Philip tore the paper, revealing a handmade astronomy diary with pages for notes, celestial maps, and spaces to paste photographs. "To record our observations," he managed to say, emotion making speech even more difficult. Peter nodded, smiling. "Exactly. We'll make a record of everything we discover together." Richard observed the exchange, feeling simultaneously part of and stranger to that moment. The connection between the boys was so natural, so fluid. There was still so much he needed to learn. The night passed like a dream. The astronomy teacher showed constellations, planets, nebulae. Philip absorbed each piece of information with bright eyes, asking questions that Peter sometimes needed to translate, but that demonstrated impressive knowledge and curiosity. At one point, Richard stepped away a bit, observing the scene from afar. His son, laughing under the stars. His son being simply a 10-year-old boy, fascinated by the universe. His son, alive in a way he had never been within the mansion's walls. Emily approached, offering him a cup of hot tea. "Thank you," he said, accepting the drink. "For everything." "For your son," the woman smiled, following his gaze to where Peter and Philip conversed animatedly, pointing to the sky. "Peter always had that gift," she commented, "of seeing people beyond their circumstances. When my husband died and we were left alone, he was very small, but he never let me give up. He always found joy where I only saw difficulties." Richard nodded, understanding. Philip has never been so happy. "Never had a friend like this." "And you?" asked Emily, surprising him. "You also seem different." Richard reflected on the observation. It was true. Something was changing inside him, slowly, but inexorably. Work no longer seemed so urgent. The mansion no longer seemed so empty. And Philip no longer seemed like a duty. but a gift he was just beginning to understand. "I'm learning," he replied simply. "Late, but I am." The months transformed into a year, and the changes consolidated. The friendship between Peter and Philip became an integral part of life in the mansion. Richard reorganized his schedule, dedicating more time to his son. He began participating in therapy sessions, learning about Philip's condition not just as a medical problem, but as part of who his son was. The sunflower bed they had planted together bloomed vigorously, the tall, strong flowers faithfully turning toward the sun each morning. It became a symbol for everyone in the house, of persistence, of unexpected beauty, of simple things that bring joy. One spring afternoon, Richard returned earlier from the office, something that was becoming increasingly frequent. He found the boys in the garden, Peter reading aloud while Philip listened attentively, reclining on pillows on the grass outside his wheelchair, a freedom that had once seemed impossible, but now happened regularly under careful supervision. Richard stopped at a distance, not wanting to interrupt. There was a peace in the scene that touched him deeply. That's when he noticed something surprising. Beside Philip, on the ground, was a digital recorder. The boy pressed a button with effort, and the device began to speak with his voice. Not the truncated and difficult voice of the rare times he tried to communicate orally, but a clear, pre-recorded voice reproducing complete sentences. "My turn to tell a story," said the recorder, with words obviously selected and recorded previously. Peter smiled, closing the book. "Of course, astronaut. All yours." Philip pressed another button, and another sentence sounded. "Once upon a time, there was a boy who wanted to reach the stars." Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. His son had found a new way to communicate, to express himself, and it had been Peter, with his simple and intuitive creativity, who had made this possible. He approached slowly, announcing his presence. The boys looked up, and Philip's face lit up upon seeing his father. "Hello," said Richard, sitting on the grass beside them, not caring about his expensive suit. "May I join you?" Philip pressed another button. "Of course, Dad. I'm telling a story." Richard smiled, feeling his heart expand in his chest. "I'm listening, son. I'm here to listen." The future opened like a horizon of possibilities that had once seemed unreachable. Peter began considering universities, dreaming of a career in astrophysics, with the discreet but firm support of Richard, who saw in the young man not just his son's friend, but a brilliant youth who deserved opportunities. Philip continued progressing, increasingly using the communication system Peter had helped develop. His personality, once imprisoned by physical limitations, bloomed more each day, revealing sense of humor, intelligence, and a determination that Richard now recognized as Laura's legacy. The mansion, once a cold and silent space, gradually became a home. The walls that witnessed so much loneliness now echoed conversations, laughter, life. Richard's empire continued, but no longer at the cost of his humanity. He had learned, finally, what Peter knew instinctively, that true wealth lay in genuine connections, not in bank accounts or lucrative businesses. One particularly significant afternoon, 3 years after their first meeting, Richard watched from the veranda while Peter and Philip, now teenagers, revisited the sunflower bed. The originals had long completed their cycle, but new ones were planted each spring, becoming a tradition. Peter, now 19, taller and more mature, still showed the same patience and enthusiasm when interacting with Philip, who at 13 continued limited by paralysis, but had found ways to express a vibrant and profound personality. "Do you know what sunflower means in scientific language?" asked Peter, helping Philip get better settled in the adapted chair they used for garden activities. Philip typed on his communication device, which he now used skillfully. "Helianthus," from Greek helios for sun and anthos for flower. "Exactly," Peter smiled, impressed as always with his friend's knowledge. "And they always turn toward the sun, no matter where it is in the sky." Philip typed again, "Like people who always find light, even when it seems impossible." Richard felt the weight of those words. How many times in the dark years after Laura's death had he believed there was no more light in his life? And how, many times since then, had he been surprised by the luminosity that emanated from his son, from this simple teenager who had entered their lives, and even from himself when he finally allowed himself to feel, instead of just function. At that moment, he made a decision that had been maturing for some time. He went down the veranda steps and approached the boys, who looked up, smiling. "I have something for you," he announced, extending 2 envelopes. Peter accepted his with, curiosity, while Philip used his device to ask, "What is this, Dad?" "Open them," Richard replied, feeling a mixture of nervousness and certainty. Peter's envelope contained documents for a full scholarship to the country's best astronomy university. Philip's contained the project for a foundation, the Laura Thompson Foundation, dedicated to developing assistive technology for children with disabilities, with Philip as principal consultant. I don't know what to say," Peter stammered, his eyes wide at the opportunity that would change his life. Philip typed quickly, "A foundation with Mom's name? To help children like me?" Richard nodded, crouching to be at his son's eye level. "You both taught me that the greatest riches aren't those we accumulate, but those we share. Peter, you deserve to fulfill your dream. And Philip, you have so much to offer the world, so much wisdom to share." "But why?" asked Peter, still stunned. Richard looked at the sunflowers, then at the two young men before him. "Because you showed me how to find light again. Like sunflowers, but in reverse. You were the sun when everything seemed dark." Philip activated his device. "Shall we do this together? All three of us." "All three," confirmed Richard, finally feeling complete. "And maybe in time, we can help many others find their own sun." Peter smiled, looking at his friend, and then at the man who, in a way, had also become a father figure to him. "Like a constellation," he said. "Separate stars that, together, form something greater." Philip typed his final response, words that summarized the extraordinary journey they had shared. A constellation of sunflowers, always seeking light, always growing together. Richard embraced his son, then extended his arm to include Peter. There, among the flowers that symbolized their transformation, he felt deeply grateful for the improbable path that had brought them together. A millionaire who believed he had seen everything, a boy trapped in his own body, and the cook's son who, with simplicity and courage, had taught them both the true meaning of wealth. The tree we planted in the garden has already grown, and under its shade today rest three hearts that learned that the most valuable lessons don't come from boardrooms, nor from expensive books, but from simple gestures that transform lives. If stories like this touched you, share them, because in every heart there's a dormant sunflower, waiting only for the right light to bloom. If this story moved you, share the video with someone special. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell, so you don't miss the next stories of overcoming friendship and true love.